in those statements. Thank you very much. Madam President, today I come to the floor to once again talk about the tragic shooting that occurred at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, Parkland, Florida, now a long time back, February the 14th, 2018, and the Justice Department's response to it. Part of my oversight work to see that the laws are faithfully executed. But before I get to that, I want to express, as we all have done, I'm sure many times, our condolences to those victims and families of the school shooting in Michigan last month. The shooting was an act of evil, and we ought to pray for the affected victims. Recently, the Justice Department reached a settlement with the families involved in the Parkland shooting for a reported $130 million. The school shooting was another evil act. It took the lives of 17 innocent students and teachers. Based on reports, the Justice Department settled because the FBI failed to properly investigate tips warning federal law enforcement personnel about the coming attack that happened on that February 18th. This was a concern of mine from the beginning. Even though the Justice Department has settled the matter, the department hasn't fully been transparent with the Congress on this issue. And they ought to be, because this taxpayers' money, however it's used, the public ought to know it. The public's business ought to be public. I'm going to highlight some of the oversight steps that I've taken and how the FBI still hasn't done what they said they need to do. 2 days after the shooting, while I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I wrote to the FBI asking about its failure to act on tips that they had received about the dangers that this shooter might cause against the public at large. I also wrote to Google about the threats made in YouTube comment that the shooter apparently made. After that, I brought the FBI in to brief the full Judiciary Committee on February the 23rd, 2018. That's just 5 days after the accident happened, the shooting happened. Not an accident, it was intended. I'm sorry I used the word accident. And I did the same thing with Google and Facebook staff to discuss their cooperation with law enforcement. On March the 14th, 2018, I led a full committee oversight hearing to hold the Justice Department and the FBI accountable for their failures. In the FBI briefing and at the committee's March 14th, 2018 hearing, then FBI Deputy Director David Bowditch said that the FBI had begun a review of the internal process failures. Those failures related to the intake procedure for call-in tips and what transpired in the Parkland case in regard to those call-in tip-offs. For months after the hearing, my staff asked for updates regarding the FBI's investigation report. In May 2018, they were told, my staff was told, it would be final by approximately mid-June 2018. On August 27, 2018, I wrote to FBI Director Wray, noting that up to this point, quote from my letter, committee staff have requested a copy of the report 7 times from the FBI. Here we are now, 3 years later, 2021, and the FBI still hasn't produced the report to Congress. Time and again, the Justice Department and the FBI have failed to live up to the standards of transparency required of them. The Parkland shooting and the department's response to it is another example from a growing list of shortcomings. Simply put, there is no basis for the department and the FBI to hold the Parkland report from Congress, and by holding it from Congress, they're withholding it from the American people. That's especially true for those families that suffered the tragic loss. Transparency brings accountability, and the more the department fights that principle, the brighter light will be shined on them. Now, going forward, while we can't take back the terrible events of that day, we can and we must take steps to make sure such horrific acts don't ever happen again. That's why earlier this year, along with a bipartisan group of senators, I introduced a bill that I called the Eagles Act. The Eagles Act because that's the mascot of the Parkland High School. The Eagles Act will help fund and reauthorize the U.S. Secret Service's National Threat Assessment Center. That's where the U.S. Secret Service study targeted violence and proactively identify and manage threats before they result in more tragedies. It would also establish a Safe School initiative to look at school violence prevention and expand research on school violence. The Eagles Act is a common sense bill supported by over 40 state attorneys general and representatives from both sides. In other words, for decades, the Secret Service has been instructing people how to recognize people that may be a threat to the public at large or a threat to themselves so that there can be intervention. So if we do the same thing for people in education, the school teachers, the administrators, other support staff, they can have the same training that the Secret Service gives to other people, but not to school people. Then maybe we can have interventions on future school shootings so that they don't happen again. I ask and encourage all of my Senate colleagues to help pass this bill. And then on a shorter version of another subject, I'd like to say to my colleagues, last week, all Republican members of the Senate Judiciary Committee sent Attorney General Garland a letter. We said he should withdraw his memo from October 4th that made parents feel like domestic terrorists for going to local school board meetings to express their views on anything that they have a constitutional right to have their expressed views on, and there's no limit in the Constitution. Also, the members of this Senate Republican minority agreed that true criminal acts should be prosecuted. Now, unfortunately, the Attorney General is going in the wrong direction. A whistleblower revealed FBI's counterterrorism division is involved in the Department of Justice effort of intimidation and is keeping track of what goes on at local school board levels, whether it's criminal or not. This flies in the face of what Attorney General Garland testified to the Judiciary Committee. The Attorney General has insisted to the committee that his instructions to law enforcement have nothing to do with stopping parents from criticizing school boards, and that he doesn't think parents are domestic terrorists. But his own FBI doesn't see it that way. Last week, one of my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee defended the Attorney General and his memo, That member talked about school board members getting angry emails and being threatened if the facts discussed by my colleague rise to being crimes. They sound like the sort of things local law enforcement can handle just fine on their own. There's no need for FBI involvement or National Security Division involvement, which ought to be involved with strictly terrorism. But we should all agree that the FBI's counterterrorism division should have nothing to do with it. If you're a parent who's upset with how your child's school is being run, you should be able to say so to the very school board making decisions on how that school should be run. But will the FBI's counterterrorism division keep a record of what you say at the school board meetings? If so, that ought to concern all of us. I've gotten many letters from constituents worried about this sort of thing. Mr. Attorney General, parents are not terrorists, not domestic terrorists. You said so yourself. Now prove that you mean it. So the simple way to prove it is call off the FBI's counterterrorism division, withdraw your October 4th memo. I yield the floor.